Good morning and welcome to the Full Scottish. It's been quite a week. A week ago, I don't imagine very many people in the country were familiar with CNN or any of the anchor men and women, but we've now all become self professed experts on US constitutional law and electoral law. We can now confidently tell the difference between skinny ballots and absentee ballots. But what a week it's been. Obviously, unless you've been in a hole somewhere, you'll know that Joe Biden has won the presidential election. It was finally called by CNN and all the other national networks, including Fox News, much to the disgruntlement of Donald Trump, on Friday. I'm joined today in the studio by two guests. Robert Dawson Scott. Robert's an ex-colleague of mine from the Scotsman. Back in the distant past, he was a journalist. He's now a playwright and critic and a doctoral research fellow at Edinburgh University. And Sue Lyons from Highland, who's a member of the Women for India National Committee, the writer of the fantastic blog I'm Not a Writer, and also sits on the board of the Poverty Alliance and has a particular interest in rural poverty. Good morning to you both.
Morning. Hello.
And can I ask you, what's the one thing you now know about the American electoral system that you didn't before this week, Robert?
I don't know. Well, I've been watching the whole of The West Wing from top to bottom over the last few weeks as a kind of fantasy escape from real US politics, and there's a tremendous amount of information there. So, apart from the fact that Joe Biden is no Matt Santos or Jimmy Smits, the actor who played that role, if anybody remembers the series, I was reasonably well placed, but I think I didn't understand why they didn't count the postal votes before they counted the votes in person and all that kind of stuff. That was all very complicated. And there was all sorts of details about military votes arriving late and so on. So lots of detail, yeah.
Yeah. And Sue, what have you learned that you didn't know before?
Lots of things. I've learned where some states are not where I thought they were, which was quite interesting. I've also learned, I'm quite interested in this idea of cured ballots, that if there's something not quite right with your ballot, you can go back and rectify it. I've been quite interested in that.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of strange, especially as you'd be rectifying it after the polls had closed, and you could argue you'd be influenced by the results. I thought that was quite strange. I think the thing that has been the most interesting, and I think the thing that people maybe didn't realise, is that election legislation is not federal, it's state managed, and that's why every state does it differently. So some states don't allow you to count the postal ballots until after the polls have closed. Others are able to do that, which is why some states were able to deliver and announce quite quickly, and obviously others, it's taken 4 or 5 days. What I've found amusing, slightly annoying maybe, is lots of people on social media weighing in on the debate and saying Donald Trump's an idiot, doesn't know anything about postal ballots. And these are the same people that were promoting conspiracy theories about postal ballots in the 2014 independence referendum and don't trust postal ballots. So it'll be interesting to see at the May election, where the SNP certainly encouraged their members to use postal ballots rather than turning up on the day, if attitudes to postal ballots change. But apart from that, traditionally, one of the things we look for with a new president is what he does in the first 100 days. Now, obviously, he probably won't be able to control the Senate, although there are some runoffs and that might change. But given that he's going to have a problem getting legislation through the Senate, what do you think we can expect, Sue, in his first 100 days? What should be his big ticket issues that he's going to promote?
Well, Maggie, I watched what he said last night. I watched it live. It was quite interesting, I thought. And I think he set out quite a lot himself about what his priorities are going to be. He talked a lot about COVID and setting up a pandemic sort of task force. He spoke about race, and he spoke about a fairer place for people, and said that the people he recruits to help him with that will reflect America. So it will be interesting to see if that happens, I think.
Robert, what about you?
Yeah, I think obviously COVID is going to be at the top of the agenda, and I'd be very surprised if he doesn't take a whole lot of the executive orders that Trump signed and reverse them, because he can do that without the Senate. One of Trump's problems was that they weren't approved, by Congress in the first place. So I would hope that there'll be a number of things. I mean, he made quite a noise about climate change. He definitely acknowledged during the campaign that he had changed his position on climate change and was taking it much more seriously. There was quite a lot of environmental protections that Trump wrote off. So I would hope, it's not really a prediction, it's more of a hope that he will move on that quite quickly. Not least drilling in the Arctic, on the North Slope, and some of the water standard regulations that Trump got rid of. But as I say, that's more hope than expectation.
One of the strengths of Biden, and I hadn't realised, he's been 48 years in politics, which is a tremendous experience, especially when you consider that Trump had no experience whatsoever. One of the things that he's famous for is reaching across the aisle and working with the opposition. He's always done that as a senator. He did it as Obama's vice president. And there's even the suggestions that he's looking at key Republicans for possibly cabinet posts, or if not cabinet posts, at least to run key federal agencies. Now, some on the left of the party will be unhappy with that. But do you think, given that Trump is now gone and in time the Republican Party will have to regroup, try and disown Trump, maybe they won't, do you think there's much hope that he will be able to get some concessions from Senate, even if it is against him? Robert?
I think that's one of the single biggest questions that come out of all this. There are some kind of maneuvers about appointing Republican senators to the cabinet, creating vacancies where possibly Democratic state governors can then appoint senators, pending reruns of the election. You get about 6 months worth. The question is, which underlies your question, is to what extent American politics has now become so polarized that it's impossible to go back. You've seen, and again, I'm sorry to refer back to the West Wing, but the West Wing fictional kind of proposition is that it's a Democratic president in a Republican-controlled Senate, exactly where we are now. But 20 years ago, where it was started, it was normal for legislation to proceed on bipartisan basis, that there would be, as you say, reaching across the aisle, and there'd be quite middle-of-the-road Republican senators and indeed quite hawkish Democratic senators as well. What has happened in the last 4 years is that all of that sort of sense of cooperation has completely disappeared. You only had to look at the way it started before Obama left office with the Senate's refusal to approve a Supreme Court justice, and we saw what happened in the last few months with what's her name, the new woman that's just been appointed in place of RBG. And I think, it's very difficult when you've had those kind of brutal, diametrically opposed, divisive, etc., to row back from that. It takes people to behave in a statesmanlike way, a way in which I think Biden, fine, but whether the other individual senators are, have any appetite to do that is as I say, the big unanswered question.
So one of the things that people are saying is that his cabinet will be the most diverse of any cabinet there's been. People of colour, people of different religions, LGBTQI, all sorts. So obviously that's going to be supported by the fantastic appointment of Kamala Harris as VP, first woman vice president, first woman of colour, with a real shot, I would have thought, at the White House in 4 years, because it's unlikely that Biden will go for a second term just because of his age. So what are your feelings about Harris? What is she going to do quickly? What's going to be her key message to people? And obviously in a country where race is such a huge issue, it could have been argued as a gamble to put a black woman on the ticket, but it has obviously paid off. So what are you feeling about Harris?
Well, I really like her. I watched her speak again last night, and I really liked her. I think that it's a very powerful message. I think the first woman and the first woman of color as vice president in the White House is an amazing message to start with. I think that one of the things that I read today was that I think it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think she's called. She said that the party has a sort of history of getting really excited about grassroots during the campaign, but then sort of forgetting about them once they're in power and sort of putting them on the back burner. I think this appointment of Kamala Harris will mean that that doesn't happen in the same way. I think when you look at how Black activists mobilised and increased the vote, it's really important, particularly given we've got runoffs as well, it's really important that they don't just go, thanks very much, and off you go now. And I think that she will make sure that that happens in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, grassroots politics in the United States is quite phenomenal. And you think about the numbers of people who have been out campaigning. And whatever you think of Trump, he motivated his people to get out and vote in ways that people didn't think would happen. I mean, it's pretty obvious that most of the people who were Republicans. Yeah, Robert? I thought you were coming in there. And I think that's another issue. So it's not just about senators deciding whether they're going to stay divided and whether they're going to keep the Trump legacy going or return to a more traditional view of republicanism. It's actually about the people out on the street. And obviously at the moment they are there, they are simply repeating the allegations that Trump is making in exactly the same language with no evidence. When he finally goes, and of course he's talking about leaving the country and maybe coming to Scotland, which is a horrific idea, and he's no longer getting media coverage because even Fox News seemed to have kind of turned against him. Do you think his grassroots support will go back in their boxes and behave themselves? Or is that genie out the bottle and we're just going to face with that aggressive, threatening behaviour for the next 4 years?
Well, there's a really interesting piece by Matthew Paris in the Times yesterday. Paris, as you know, ex-Tory MP, big Thatcher fan, but one of the more kind of reasoned voices of the right in the UK. And he was kind of saying, you have to recognise there were some things that Trump was right about. And he mentions the fact that, talks about China, talks about getting people to pay out for NATO and so on. And the other point he makes is that for the Democratic Party to get in a situation where Hillary Clinton was able to say that people who didn't vote, people who voted for Trump were deplorable, that infamous line, that's a political party which is in difficulty, has lost touch in some way. You simply can't write off half the population as if they don't matter. So no, I don't think they will go back into their box or whatever you like to put it. I think that there are lots of things that they've been given confidence. Let's not forget, Trump got more votes than he did last time. 71 million people still voted for him. It's not as if white women or Latinos, 47% of the Latinos in Texas voted for Trump. Perhaps because of the wall, who knows? We'll have to wait till the fallout. So no, I don't think it's going to go away at all. And I think that if Biden and the Democrats think it is, they are fooling themselves.
Yeah,
however, just going back.
The female vote for Trump has always astonished me, and it seems to have gone up this time. But interesting what you're saying. That if a party...
My favourite line about Kamala Harris was a little meme going around this morning, which reads, "Rosa sat so Ruby could walk, so Kamala could run." Ruby Bridges being a little girl.
That's fantastic. Good. That needs to go on a T-shirt.
Which I thought was really, really beautiful. Yeah, exactly.
You were saying that if a party has to resort to insults and is dismissive of the opposition's base, that's a party in trouble. That's exactly what's happened here with, first of all, independence, where the narrative from both sides is often to be horribly dismissive of the other. And in the same way that I don't think you necessarily change someone's mind by waving a flag in their face, you certainly don't change someone's mind by telling them they're stupid. And the same thing happened with Brexit. So it seems to be a pattern in politics. You know what they say, it happens in America, it happens in Britain 10 years later. Just want to think then about where Britain now stands when Trump is gone. So Boris Johnson sent a very measured response. Scottish Government's response was a bit more enthusiastic. But Boris Johnson has kind of modelled himself as the British Trump. So he's now isolated. And obviously there's the big issues around Brexit. The Senate, the Congress, the Democratic-controlled House, has already said they will not support anything that damages the Good Friday Agreement or damages Northern Ireland in terms of trade talks. So what do you think the impact on Britain will be with Biden in the White House? Sue?
I think it's going to be really interesting. I think that Boris Johnson and his government have they've sort of held this idea that a trade deal with America is going to be really important and the cornerstone, and that is looking less likely, I think, in the way that they would want it to be. I think that I've certainly read that Biden is more likely to want a trade deal with the EU than to rush to have a trade deal with the UK post-Brexit. I think that leaves, as you've just said, Maggie, it leaves the UK isolated and on a bit of a shakier ground than we were. You know, we had all these promises of trade deals are going to be easy and it's going to be like people are going to be knocking on our door, and that's not materialised even without this change. I think this change makes the whole foundation of what happens post-Brexit trickier and shakier.
Robert? Oh, Robert, are you there?
Yeah, don't forget Biden has Irish roots as well. It's unlikely to take a different view from the when he gets there. I don't know enough to be completely dogmatic about it, but I agree with Louis Johnson looking. I mean, the of Sunak to take over as has become more and more spoken out loud as the weeks gone past. It's a big profile of Sunak in the Mail on Sunday today. It's like the conventional wisdom is that they're going to the Tories will let Boris do Brexit and then get rid of him so they can blame him for everything goes wrong. And in 4 years' time, they'll have dealt with all that. Who knows?
I think
it's very difficult for those who thought that Brexit was a terrible idea in the first place, which includes over 60% of the population of Scotland, to find any kind of anything to say about Brexit except stop it. But unfortunately, doesn't appear to be going to happen.
Yeah, but it might stop Johnson. I agree. I think Johnson's already looking a bit weak, and this shift in attitude. I mean, in some ways, it's not about what Biden will or won't do. It's about the fact that Biden just isn't Trump, and he's not Trump in the completely diametrically opposite way. He's measured, he looks presidential, he's calm, he doesn't, as far as we know, tell outrageous lies. And as I say, he's got 48 years experience, which has to make a huge difference. Just sticking with COVID then, as you raised it, and obviously one of the reasons that Boris is weak is because of his response to COVID, and things are obviously not getting any better in England, they're getting worse. The figures here are not great, I have to say. The most recent statistics tell us that there were 1,596 new cases of COVID in Scotland, 39 new deaths reported, which brings the total of people who've died in Scotland to over 3,000, which is tragic. Hospital admissions are slightly stabilising, but they're going up and down a bit, and the concern on ICU is growing, and clearly it's a lot worse in England. we will find out next week if any of the Scottish areas and local authority areas are changing their tier. There's a lot of annoyance in the border area because they think that they're in too high a tier and should be reduced, but you might argue you're on the border next to a country where things are worse, so actually you have to stay. But I'm particularly interested on the impacts, Sue, of COVID on rural communities, because I think sometimes that gets ignored. So can you give us a snapshot from your position and with your particular interest in rural poverty as to how much COVID is adding to the problems in rural Scotland of poverty and hardship?
Well, you know, rural poverty is quite often something which people don't recognise is happening even in their own community. This is probably, I think, going to shine a light on it in a bit more of a way than we've seen before. Jobs and particularly seasonal work is just been terrible this year. My husband works as a tour guide and he hasn't worked at all this year, whereas he would normally work continuously from April to October. And he's not the only one, you know. The organisation that he works for has something like, I don't know, 9 guys, and none of them have worked at the top. And that brings real pressures on families and communities. We've seen a magnificent community response in many of our rural communities to supporting people who are shielding and who are struggling with poverty and food poverty particularly. But I don't know how companies that have had to close will be able to reopen next year. And some of the businesses, even in Inverness, which is quite busy really at the moment, you know, we're in a tier 1, I think, and yesterday when I drove through town, there was lots of people out and about, and you can see people having coffee and in cafes and meals in restaurants. But this whole stop, start, and then we hit winter. There's not a lot of work, particularly in remote and rural communities. I think we're going to find next year that some businesses won't open at all, and that's going to impact massively on the ability of people to put food on the table and pay their rent.
But I mean, COVID's not just the only thing that's affecting the rural economy. The rural economy in Scotland has other huge issues and things that hold it back. And there's a lot of feeling that, you know, it's ignored by the central belt, and those of us that live in the cities are not, you know, we're quite interested to go there on our holidays, but we're not really interested in understanding how rural Scotland works. There's been some money announced today by the Scottish Government. I think £1 million has been given to the langoustine industry to help them because they're suffering, particularly because of Brexit, because they're not going to be able to export. But it feels that these things are little drips, and there doesn't feel that there's a real roadmap for rural Scotland. Is that fair, Susan, do you think?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I think that what we're seeing is this sort of blow after blow after blow after blow. So we have Brexit, we have COVID, we have issues around transport and housing that don't really get resolved at all. So people still today living in my nearest village can't get a childminder in the village if they're a working family. You know, there's no registered childminder in that village. And I had that when I lived in Caithness in 2000. 20 years ago, I was facing that, and it's still not resolved. And these issues around being able to access work, being able to access transport, and the impact of that on people living in poverty is really challenging, I think.
So what needs to happen? If you had Nicola Sturgeon in front of you, what would you tell her needs to happen?
Communities. I think communities need to have the power and the financial wherewithal to resolve some of these issues. And if you look at things like transport, for instance, communities need to be able to have control over that. We ran an event which the Poverty and Inequality Commission came along to last year about transport. I went to an event in Glasgow and said, you need to hear from rural communities. So bless them, the Poverty and Inequality Commission said, that's great, Sue, thanks very much for suggesting that you can organise it. So I did. And instead of bringing them to Inverness, I took them to Leg.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Leg is fairly accessible. It's on a railway line. It's, there's a train station. But the train station is like a mile or 2 miles out of the village, and it is, it's not as accessible as you perhaps might look at it and say, oh, well, they've got a train and they've got a bus, they'll be fine. And we brought people from Fort William and from up the West Coast and from Caithness to talk about transport and the issues that people are facing with that. And what I would say is give communities the ability to sort out their own issues, and you need to do that with money, but also you need to support the third sector properly in our rural communities, and that doesn't always happen, I don't think.
Interesting then, you put the answer in the hands of community. That ties in quite nicely with the fact that it's 10 years since Andy Whiteman wrote his seminal book, The Poor Had No Lawyers, which effectively is explaining who owns Scotland and how they got their hands on it, and that most of the land that is owned by landowners was land that was in common ownership and is no more. So I know, Robert, that you know quite a lot about 18th century lawyers and financial institutions.
Well,
which was quite convenient for today. So can you just give us a quick snapshot of how that happened? How did land come out of common ownership and end up under the control of a very, very small group of landowners to the detriment of community and the economy?
I mean, Andy's book is that thick, so I'm not going to be able to do anything quickly. But both before and after the Treaty of Union, the specific nature of Scots law is obscure and difficult and all the rest of it, enabled lawyers and people who had access to lawyers to manipulate it in ways that suited themselves. And you've probably, I defer to obviously in her knowledge, but you've probably both heard the story that Andy quotes of Jock the butcher out one night collecting something for the pot, countering the landowner, and the landowner saying, "What have you got there?" And the Jock sort of trying to hide the salmon or the whatever it is under his coat, and the landowner saying, "You're not entitled to that. Get off my land." Jock says, "Well, what makes it your land?" And the landowner says, "Well, I inherited it from my father." He said, "Yeah, well, what makes it your father's land?" And so it goes on, and the landowner says, well, we fought for it. And so Jock puts down the salmon, takes up his jacket, and says, "Okay, well, I'll fight you for it." And frankly, that's as good a way of understanding the system that came to pass. At the end of the 18th century, Scotland had one minister for every 800 people in the population, but it had one lawyer for 700 members of the population. So there were a lot of lawyers that were in Edinburgh, and they got their pound of flesh.
So is community ownership of land, which is now empowered through legislation and happens and has happened, some more successfully than others, is that the answer, Sue? I mean, are all landowners the enemy? Is there not some argument that well-managed land by progressive landowners is just as good for the community as a community running an estate who might not have any real experience of it?
Well, there are obviously success stories here, aren't there? The egg buyout passing crofters and all that kind of stuff. But one of the difficulties that people who work in the sector have kind of recognise or come to recognise after the passage of that legislation that you mentioned is that it's all very well to say, well, the communities must be able to what happens to land in their area and so on. But the communities themselves don't necessarily have either the skill sets of people who know how to run committees and organise budgets and all that kind of stuff, and also, frankly, don't have the time because they're making livings. So some of the well-intentioned aspects of that legislation, which obviously covers land in urban as well as is in rural areas, has actually not had the take-up that I think the government, who were very proud of that particular piece of legislation, had expected. The other problem, I don't know what Sue feels about this, is that although money has been spent on training and equipment in the Highlands, the level of infrastructure of internet infrastructure is not good enough yet. Sue, is that right?
Sue?
Yeah, there are areas where internet access is really difficult. And I said when I came along this morning that I've had to come away from my home to be sure of getting consistent internet access this morning. And I only live 8 miles out of Inverness.
Wow.
Some places, when you go up west, you've got to go down to the bottom of the garden to get a signal, and it's all very complicated. It is improving, and I think, I went up to Caithness on the train a year or so ago and was sitting at Forcenard, and there's not really very much at Forcenard, and I had fantastic 4G on my phone.
Well, we are having some technical problems today, particularly with Robert, who's actually in central Glasgow. His internet connection seems worse than Sue, who's up north.
I think
but I think as well as talking about infrastructure around the internet, I think what Robert was talking about was, is the infrastructure available to help communities actually make a go of community ownership if they don't have the skill sets? And is the fear of not having that what perhaps stopped the recent buyout of, I think it was at Morven? That estate's been in a dreadful state. It's not been managed. There was real potential, but people didn't want it. So what do you think, Sue? Do you think there needs to be more support for communities for buyouts? And what should that be? How long will that take? Because if it's not there, then it is a great piece of legislation, but it's not going to have the impact that it needs to have.
I think there needs to be more support for communities. I'm not necessarily sure that needs to focus on community buyouts alone. I think what Robert talked about communities lacking the skill set or the time to be able to progress community buyouts is one of the issues that communities face. But it's part of a bigger and wider issue. If you think you can have a really close-knit community, there was some research done in Orkney about fishermen which showed that they had a really close-knit community, and that the community made links within itself and links with people locally, but actually linking to outside the community was more difficult. And it's understanding that community and providing what that community needs, and not assuming that community land ownership is the answer. Because as you said earlier on, Maggie, some communities rely on estates, they have good relationships with estates. And although Andy Whiteman did say in his book that there is an aspect of not offending your landowner, even on good estates, on estates that are run well, people are still cautious about putting the cat amongst the pigeons and annoying their estate owners. I think that we have to do a job in persuading people in our communities that community land ownership is better. And it is, there's research that shows where land is community owned, it's economically more productive, it's more productive for communities in terms of their social lives and their society. It attracts more people to live there. So there is evidence of that. But I think within any community, you have people who like the idea, who don't like the idea, who aren't really sure. And having the wherewithal within communities to tackle that and to encourage people on board. It's okay to present an opportunity for communities to be engaged, which is what the Community Engagement Act does. It presents that community for that opportunity for communities to be engaged. But sometimes that's not enough. You have to make that happen, and you have to support communities to do that. And that's the bit that's missing, not just around buyouts, but around other things maybe.
Well, yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. You shouldn't need to have a buyout to ensure basic services. I mean, I think the childminder example is a very interesting one that you mentioned earlier, Sue. That kind of stuff. That you shouldn't need to buy out 100,000 acres of bog and moorland to have a childminder.
Exactly, and it's about landowners being better at what they're doing. One of the really kind of hot topics at the moment is the issue around sporting estates and the management of grouse moors. There was a survey recently which came out and said something like 60% of people in Scotland think that grouse shooting should be banned, that it's so last 2 centuries, and that the damage it has done to the land in Scotland and the lack of biodiversity is really concerning. But it seems to be polarising people, and again, in quite an aggressive way, which has obviously become a bit of a theme in political issues. So I know there's a motion going up to the SNP conference in a couple of weeks about grouse moors. And it's not going as far as saying sporting estates should be banned or taken back into public control. It's not even tackling the tax issues around them. It's simply enhancing the policy that the government already have, that they should be licensed, and asking that all of the poor land management that goes on around grouse moors is stopped. So the mountain hare is now protected, but making sure that other species are protected, that there's no more lead poisoning through ammunition, there's no more burning of the gorse, and a whole range of things. So that seems all quite reasonable. One of the co-authors of that motion is a female councillor in Angus, and she's being threatened and bullied on social media. They're threatening some of the moorland groups, the Southern Upland Moorland Group and I think the Angus Moorland Group, are sort of threatening to doorstop her at home over this. She's getting pretty worried. These people have guns. And it seems to be polarising. And yet, people, now maybe they're all people that live in cities, and maybe we've not got a right to say because it doesn't affect us. So 10 years on from Andy Whiteman, Robert, I want you to think about this. What has changed in our land management and what needs to change?
Well, I'm no expert, but my observation is that very little has changed. You still have the occasional very thoughtful landlord like Anders Poulsen, who's announced plans to build additional bothies on his estate. I think he's in Carrara, is that right? Anyway, but otherwise, the extraordinary durability of the landowning lobby I find absolutely bizarre, because they're never going to vote for the SNP anyway. And anyway, there aren't very many of them, kind of thing. So why is the government so pusillanimous about imposing, whatever reforms it sees fit? But you mentioned Angus. I mean, there was this notorious case in Forfar Sheriff Court not so long ago where there was film of a gamekeeper placing poison bait on a pole to trap birds of prey. There was actual film that the RSPB had acquired, and eventually they were let off because the sheriff refused to admit the film as evidence. You wonder quite what the forces are at work which enables that to still be an acceptable outcome in that situation. I mean, we shouldn't get too drawn into the story of birds of prey and all the rest of it, because there's all sorts of emotional, aren't they, lovely kind of arguments. But in terms of who's running, going back to Andy's book titled "The Poor Had No Lawyers, Who Owned Scotland," the same people own Scotland as always used to, and they still seem to have much the same kind of grip over the local judicial, political, economic, etc., levers that they've had for centuries. I find it all very, disappointing, I think.
What needs to change? What needs to happen?
Well, I think you need to see more determined action from government. I don't think these people are going to go away. They have, lots of, as I've said, they have lots of kind of perhaps non-official power behind the scenes. And until somebody decides to confront them over whatever it is, why should they bother? They always argue, oh well, we put much more money into our estates than we get out of them. Is a popular argument. Okay, well, let's see if that's true.
Sue, what do you think?
As you other ways of running these estates. I mean, at the very least, one of the curious paradoxes is that forestry actually employs more people than sheep does.
Yeah, Sue?
I think in his book, Andy Whiteman asked a question, and he asked, what is land for? And I don't think we've managed to answer that question in Scotland yet. In the 10 years since he wrote his book, we still don't know. And land is fundamentally at the heart of so many issues around Scotland. And yet we don't have a clear understanding of what our land is for. And until we have that conversation as a country, then I don't think anything will really change. I want the Scottish Government to be braver with land reform, but there's a reticence about it, and I wonder whether that reticence is that we still haven't answered this question that Andy asked us 10 years ago. I don't think we'll move further until we decide what we want for our land, for Scotland's land.
And
maybe Maggie, what we need are more green MSPs to kind of keep the SNP honest in that regard. I don't know. I mean, I think there was an interesting situation at the last election when there was a movement to say, SNP first and then Green with your second vote kind of thing. Perhaps that's one way into it. I really don't know. I mean, at the same time, the odd things. And speaking as a person who likes to go on the hills and speaking therefore for hundreds of thousands of Scots, odd things do get done. For example, there's a river crossing in Noidart, which is on a popular kind of coast-to-coast route over the River Carnac. It's right at the head of Loch Nevis. It's a really remote corner under the bottom of Schooner Keek. And the bridge, which was a rickety suspension affair, eventually got swept away in a flood, and it's been replaced. And tens of thousands of pounds were spent on replacing the bridge, and this state, to give them their due, put quite a lot of money in themselves. Of course, there's something in it for them, in terms of transportation. But some of the routes into the hills, some of the bridges, some of all those kind of things, obscure places. If they weren't there, we might miss them.
Do you think part of the issue is that so many of people in Scotland don't live in the countryside, and therefore we tend to just not care about it? We don't think it's anything to do with us. I mean, the same.
Well, you made a very good point. You made a very good point earlier on that we live in the city, we like to visit, and then come back. Okay.
Yeah, and we complain if we can't get internet access. It's a pain, but we don't have to worry about it because it's only for 2 weeks at a time.
When I worked at STV, as you mentioned, for 10 or 11 years, but STV is full of very bright, interested, young, intelligent people. I was astonished at how few of them had ever been, north of Perth. It was quite remarkable. And it's almost still this kind of two countries. Maybe it's people like me who go on the hills. That's one subset, and all the the outdoor pursuits and so on. But maybe there needs to be a better understanding in the cities of what goes on in the country. And I guess blogs like Sue's play a key role in that.
I wanted to pick up the idea as well as land reform, but also kind of food reform and sustainable food, because the two go hand in hand. And I can remember a few years ago organising for a fantastic speaker who is a kind of expert, if you like, on sustainable food production in Scotland, to address a large group of people in the East End of Glasgow. And when I proposed it, they all looked at me and they said, "What's this got to do with us? We live in the East End of Glasgow. We're not interested in what farms do." Until you pointed out, well, that's where your food comes from. Actually, you need to be interested. But there is a there is a sense, I think, that if you live in a city, it's not that important, and that's maybe what's driving it. So, and am I right in saying that do we have all the powers at the moment that we need in order to carry out land reform, or does some of it, obviously tax issues, would have to wait until independence, Sue?
Yeah, certainly some of the tax issues would have to wait until independence. And I think also, that there's class issues around it that need to be changed, and we struggle to deal with that whilst we remain in a UK which has House of Lords, and there is this sense of privilege and right. I think we will struggle to address some of the issues around land. Food sustainability of food is really interesting, and I talked briefly about some of the work that's been going on in communities around providing support for people during coronavirus who are shielding and providing food for people who are struggling financially. And I think there's much, much more we can do. I'm a member of the RDC Community Hub group, which has recently been pulled together. And that's one of the issues we're looking at as well. You can probably tell by my accent that I'm from the north of England. And there's an incredible project in a place called Todmorden, called the Incredible Edible Todmorden Project. And they turned all the sort of bits of ground around car parks in front of the town hall into places where they grew food and people could go and help themselves. I think there's a massive amount more that we could do around food and sustainable food, not just in our cities, but also around our rural areas as well.
Yeah, and actually food issues are going to become even more in the spotlight after Brexit, because so much of the Scottish economy relies on export. People keep saying, most of our food gets exported to England. It doesn't get exported to Europe. It gets exported to England in order to be processed to go into products that then get exported to Europe. So actually, it is a European issue. And I mentioned earlier that there's been money given to the langoustine industry, £1 million to help them get over the problem. So there's going to have to be a lot more of that as Brexit unfolds, because there's a real risk that we know that Scotland, the brand, is a very powerful campaign, and I think that's really, really important. So it's another issue. It does feel to me that there needs to be a real rethinking of how we are dealing with the rural parts of Scotland. And it is, as Robert says, it sometimes feels like it's two countries. It'll be interesting to see. There's a theme around those issues appearing at the SNP conference. It'll be interesting to see how much of that goes into the manifesto and into the issue. The last time I chaired the programme 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the Greens' new Green Deal, which is picking up a lot of the things, Sue, that you were talking about, especially around transport and about community empowerment. Going to go back to COVID just for a minute. There's a worrying development, you may have heard about it on the news, that a new strain of the virus has been detected in mink farms in Denmark. And unlike other strains which have affected animals, this strain is possible to transfer to humans. So we know, for example, that cats can get coronavirus, but it doesn't transfer to humans. Not so sure about dogs. But it's a new strain. It looks like the virus is mutating. So we've almost got a handle on it. We're told we now know more about it than we did. We're taking measures to keep it under control across the world. and there's a new one. So how worried do you think we should be about this, Robert?
Well, it's interesting because it becomes an argument about intensive farming. Intensive farming has kept us all fed. At the same time, it is a breeding ground for infection and all of it. You may have seen the arc through which chickens have been in this country. They became fantastically industrialized, and then eventually everybody started to protest when they found out a bit more about it. Now, actually, quite large amounts of egg production is free range or whatever it's called. I mean, I know it's not a great life being a chicken, don't get me wrong, but nevertheless, things have changed a bit. All the arguments around vegetarianism and meat eating, a lot of them depend on the fact that the meat in question is reared in satisfactory circumstances, whereas if we all ate grass-fed Aberdeen Angus, that'd be fine. So I think the mink farm, I don't think we have any left in Britain now, do we?
No.
But those intense farming measures always cause problems, and there are intense farming measures all over the world. So it's going to happen. The Danish government seems to have acted swiftly, and then once the British government seems to have acted swiftly as well, which closed down travel and so on. So I don't think these things are going to go away. I mean, COVID supposedly, provided you are not signed up to the full, what John Sokol called full caps lock version of history, was a species jump in the first place in China.
It kind of puts any potential vaccine in a bit of a difficult light. If it feels like the virus is mutating. It might not. This vaccine, which is going to be the thing that unlocks the doors and lets us all go back to hugging each other. That's slightly worrying.
The scenario is that there will be more viruses like this, and the question then is, well, do we, as a human population, just decide we're going to have to live with it, and there is going to be, a death rate, and there is going to have to be all the rest of it.
That's dangerously close to herd immunity, there, Robert.
Well, that is a question which lies out with my area of expertise, both morally and politically.
Obviously, some good news about COVID was the extension of the furlough system to the end of March. But my goodness, it took the Chancellor a long time to A, change his mind, and then B, confirm that other parts of the UK would be able to access the money even if England wasn't under lockdown, because it was increasingly feeling that it was only when the south east of England went into lockdown that it triggered the government to do something, and that's because that's where their base is, so it makes sense. But as has been pointed out by the First Minister and leaders in the north of England, it's come too late for a lot of companies that, thinking that the furlough was going to end, they've made people redundant, and that is absolutely shocking. And again, although the new furlough deal is reasonable and it's what it was before, once again, self-employed and freelance people have been forgotten by the Treasury. I mean, it's ridiculous to suggest they're going to get 40% of their year's profits, where a lot of freelance and self-employed people don't really make much of a profit, and they don't make anything like the amount of money that they would need in order for that 40% to benefit them. So what should be happening to support people who are self-employed and freelance, given that there are more self-employed people now than there has ever been? It's a really growing part of the economy. It's something that has really been a growth since the days of Thatcher. So, Sue, what do you think? What should the Westminster government be doing for those people? And can the Scottish government use any of its extra money to help them?
Well, I'm a big fan of the universal basic income. And I think if we'd gone down that route at the start of this pandemic, we wouldn't have some of the difficulties we've got just now. I think that you're right, Maggie. People have been made redundant on the strength of the fact that furlough was coming to an end at the end of October. And to make that decision and announce that it's going to continue on the last day is just It makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense economically. You'd have thought they would have been thinking ahead about this. It makes no sense politically because it just makes them look foolish, I think.
And cruel. It makes them look cruel.
Yeah, and cruel, absolutely, and cruel. I mean, we have friends who have lost their jobs precisely because furlough was ending. And then to see that it's not must be like a slap in the face for a lot of people and a lot of companies as well. I think, do we have the powers? Well, quite clearly, we don't have the powers. Scotland's been looking at universal basic income for a while. There've been some feasibility studies done
Wasn't there a pilot somewhere?
No, we haven't actually had a pilot into a universal basic income. They've looked at the
pilots, I think, in London and Holland.
Sorry?
I think there have been pilots in Finland and Holland, but certainly not in Scotland.
There have been some in the EU and in other countries. In different there are different possibilities of how you deliver that universal basic income, and different aspects of that have been looked at in different countries, being delivered in different ways. But I know there've been feasibility studies on running pilots in Scotland, and there is a commitment, I think, that certainly in Glasgow they will try and run that as a pilot, a universal basic income pilot. But without the cooperation of the UK, it is difficult because there are all sorts of implications for benefits that people get, passported benefits, for things like pensions and all sorts of things around passported benefits that make it difficult to run a pilot. I hope we will see one, and I think we've missed a trick because we could have used this time to do that. But we don't have the powers to run it as it stands at the moment without the support and the cooperation of Westminster.
So while COVID rages and while we've all been glued to the TV for the American election, obviously the business of government continues and ordinary legislation keeps going. And one of the things that has come onto the statute book this week is what the mainstream media call the smacking ban, which is a rather pejorative way to discuss a piece of legislation which is to protect children from assault. The legislation was passed in 2019, but it's only come on the statute book now. And effectively what it does is give children the protection against assault that you and I have as adults. It's called the smacking ban. So, and when you hear people criticise it, they say it's the nanny state, that the state has no business interfering and things like that. And then the great argument is, well, I got smacked when I was a kid and it didn't do me any harm. And you think, well, maybe that's not true. So what did you think about this smacking ban, Sue? Good idea, or is it a step too far for the state interference?
I think it is the right thing. I think its time has now come. I think our attitude to how we bring our children up has changed. And, you know, I have 5 children. The oldest is 31 and the youngest is 11. And I don't bring my younger children up in the way that I brought my older children up. I don't think having a smacked bottom when I was a child did me any harm, but I do not smack my younger children now.
Okay, Robert, just quickly. I'm not asking you if you smacked your children.
Yeah, I have grown up children. I have grown up children, and they're all in their 20s. I used to be of the it's no business of the government kind of thing, and this is all a storm in a teacup. But of course, it's not. And you know, the catalogue of brutality meted out by adults to children under the umbrella of They're My Children is ghastly and hideous. And yeah, it needed to be stopped, I think. So.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the end of the programme. Just to remind people that producing this costs money and we're always looking for donations. So if you'd like to donate and you'd like to sign up to Broadcasting Scotland, please get onto the website and help us continue. We have great plans to extend coverage. All it does is left for me is to thank my guests today very much. I don't know if we've got time for this. We'll try quickly. One of the things that the outgoing president always does is leave a message in the Resolute desk. That's the big desk in the Oval Office for the incoming president. Very quickly, what do you think Donald Trump's letter to Biden's going to be? Either of you?
Well, I'm always.
I didn't catch that, Robert.
Sorry, you go first, Sue.
I'm always surprised that he can actually write a sentence, but I've got a horrible feeling that what he'll write on a piece of paper is, "I'll be back," and then we'll.
I thought it would be something spectacularly childish, so pee-poo belly bub drawers, probably.
Yeah, well, I think a friend of mine said he might chain himself to the Resolute desk or he might steal it and take it with him from the White House. Thank you both very much. That's been a wide-ranging discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'll see you in 2 weeks, but the programme will be back next Sunday as well. Thank you.